Hey everyone, my name is Hebrew, and today I will be talking about incarceration rates of black men versus white men, the racism that takes place when one is incarcerated versus the other, and the impactful ways in which minority communities are affected inside and out of prisons across the United States. So first of all, it's been well known for years now that black men are 5 to 6 times more incarcerated than white men. But why is that? Is this reason for this a systematic or structural issue? Or maybe this has something to do with an institution level issue surrounding corrupt police hierarchies and maybe the environment in which these police stations are placed. So I will now be showing you guys a 45-second short video that shows and talks about the idea of incarceration and the strong correlations between American prisons and race in the US. It will be talking from quite a statistical point of view, so it'll be good to see how everything works from that perspective.
The United States has the largest prison population on Earth. The country has 5% of the world's population, but nearly a quarter of all its prisoners. African American men are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. And African American men under 35 without a high school diploma are more likely to be imprisoned than employed in the labor market. Nearly 6 million former felons are denied the right to vote. That means 1 in 40 adults are disenfranchised, and 1 in 13 African Americans. The United States has the largest prison population on Earth.
Alright, so now we'll get right into the first source as you move on to the second slide. Incarceration from a very statistical viewpoint, which was good. So in the first source I found by Christopher Mueller, it talks quite a bit about the rise of racial disparities within American incarceration. He gets across this point that regional and geographic changes in migrations somewhat may have been attributed to racial inequalities and disparities for the incarceration rates. And then he goes on to discuss how racial inequality in incarceration has never been fully understood or explained, and that quote-unquote, it is easy enough to demonstrate that African Americans are arrested for criminal activity, convicted, and sent to prison at much higher rates than are whites, but it is more difficult to demonstrate that racial discrimination inside of the criminal justice system is directly implicated in each of these disparities, quote-unquote. Clearly, based on Mueller's examination of the sudden rise of incarceration rates of black men in the US since the 1970s, there's no clear direct answer as to why or how racial disparities increased exponentially. However, context clues to different time periods and how the country has grown since then can give ideas of how the rates started dramatically shifting in the US. So in the second source that I found, written by Susan Dewey, she discusses the anthropologies of the US criminal justice system. She starts off by talking about the huge role of human rights in the criminal justice system, that people with limited mobility in the human rights realm, black people, minorities, disabled people, and even LGBTQ+ people have less wiggle room in a prison setting because of the disparities and inequalities that have always existed and have been on the rise since the late 1900s. Dewey also mentions the stop and frisk policy in New York City and its own controversial practices because of the fact that many people have found it to be unconstitutional because it disproportionately targets people of color. So just being able to recognize that these racial disparities means recognizing that the US justice system is systematically racist and has been for hundreds of years. It has put hundreds of thousands of black men and other minorities and genders at an unequal standpoint just because of the ridiculous assumptions that they hold about the color of their skin. The fact of the matter is, people are constantly in pain everywhere because of the outright racism that takes place, the anger, the frustration, the overwhelming sadness that rushes through incarcerated individuals' families everywhere in the United States is never a good image of how badly prejudiced the US criminal justice system is and can be. So like I said before, assumptions about an individual's race is highly impactful on people everywhere in the US because it puts people at unequal standing points. So then we go to source number 3. Joseph Jones, the writer of my third found source, discusses how community issues among minority groups like substance abuse, crime and violence, and drug trafficking have been commonly used as a justification for the rise of incarcerated black men from urban communities across the United States. He states that there has been an incarceration epidemic for black men and its impact on black family structure and communities. So it's actually quite interesting because both Desmond King and Jennifer Page, the two authors of source number 4, and Brett Williams, the author of source number 5, both share paper topics that go together quite well. King and Page wrote a paper on transitional justice after the end of mass incarceration of black individuals as well as black reparations, while Williams wrote about how the harsh incarceration of young black individuals has no justice, but instead a semblance of peace in the U.S. So, Hebrew, how do these two completely independent authors have anything to do with each other, you may ask? Well, the fact that they both discuss varied topics surrounding the ever-so-constant rising incarceration of people of color and the idea of justice and peace within these issues already shows some sort of connection, whether or not they actually are. Williams talks about the rigid structure of inequality that grows starker and more punishing by the day. He explains that even after 60-plus years of community organizing, civil disobedience, and legal battles regarding systemic racism and the emotional, mental, and physical turmoil as a result of it, conditions across America have only gotten worse. On the other hand, King and Page, from the fifth source, discuss the reparations movement and how these domestic transitions and reparations could help prepare the United States for a formal investigation into America's legacy of racial injustice. So, there are millions of people whose ancestors have struggled with the emotional, mental, and physical turmoil and outright racism that has occurred the last few hundred years. Still, the war is not over. So many people want to be able to live freely without the worries of someone or a group of people stabbing them on their commute home because this group assumes that they're dangerous. There's still so much that Black American citizens have yet to fight for and against. Even just recognizing that America's legacy of racial injustices exists could dramatically push this country to a more immense state of reparations that could then take place, more reparations than this country has ever had before. However, the fact that we are still struggling with how mass incarceration and systemic racism play into the constant rise of the incarceration of people of color shows that we as a country are behind in getting closer to reparations. It is not impossible to reach that point, though. We are always making progress, no matter how slow and frustrating and annoying it is. As long as the majority of this country recognizes that racial injustices and inequalities are still very much existent, then I believe that we'll be heading towards reparations within the next 2 decades or so.